Hello and welcome. This is Carolyn Woods from InEight, and I am pleased to bring you another one of Rick's Tricks webinars. Today we are talking about, he's got expert tips on taking the stress out of bid reviews. Rick is one of the superstars here at InEight, Heritage Hard Dollar, for those of you who are familiar with the original product that became InEight Estimate. Rick is responsible for our outreach efforts within the industry. So Rick works with some of the most strategic customers for InEight, actually working to get them deployed. There's a lot of work on process and implementation for our systems. He's been with InEight for a very long time, since 1998. He probably has had the most touches with customers, so he's got some fantastic stories from the road. And best of all, I think we have sent him to a total of 35 countries, Rick, over the years.
That sounds about right.
That's a lot of stamps in the passport. So I encourage you, the lines will be closed for today's webinar, but I encourage you to go ahead and type in questions in the question window at any time. I'll get those on my end, and then I will tee those up for Rick at the end of his presentation today. Rick, if you're ready, take it away.
Let's do this. Well, thank you, Carolyn, for the kind introduction. And today we're going to talk about taking the stress out of preparing for a bid review. We broke this down to a couple of different areas in which we want to focus. Obviously, we've got our internal audience, we've got our internal bid review team, and what we're going to focus on here is just making sure common mistakes aren't made, making sure that as an estimator you can defend your cost estimate. And then another bullet point I added just to make sure we're all teed up in terms of quantities and scope, making sure that we have a good understanding, not only ourselves as perhaps a prime contractor, but we want to make sure there's alignment with the client, the owner, as well as any subcontractors or material vendors with whom we're going to be doing business on this prospective project. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about the market. So obviously we want to make sure our costs are in order, and now we want to turn those costs into a customer-facing price. What can the market tell us about how we might need to prepare our customer-facing proposal? So we want to explore a few things there. And then ultimately, we're going to have the client or the customer, and we want to understand, are there any gotchas that might get us there? So are there any statutory thresholds that we need to meet? We also want to explore what is the strategic value of this opportunity for our organization, and maybe we can look back on previous bids we've put together for this particular customer, and maybe there's an opportunity to learn from the past as well. So these are the three broad areas that we wanted to explore, and we'll go into a little bit of detail in each one of these. But I thought it would be interesting not just to look at the cost estimate itself, but what are some of the drivers in the market that might affect our pricing or our proposal, and then again we'll focus on what the customer's requirements are, and maybe some history we have with this particular customer. So let's get into it. As many of our webinars begin, we have these very lofty statements, and then we spend the rest of the hour figuring out, okay, how are we gonna do this? So that's what we want to address.
Please unravel.
How exactly? So number one, avoiding common mistakes. As Carolyn had mentioned, I've been with the company going on 21 years. The company was in business and was a growing concern when I joined. So we've got a lot of collective experience serving a market for well over 25, probably close to 30 years. And our customers, as you might imagine, in the construction industry, aren't really shy. So they've kind of goaded us along the way and encouraged us to be able to look for things that maybe we've left out of an estimate. So the key things here are going to be, do we have anything in the body of the estimate that has a zero cost or quantity? That refers to not only resources that we might be using within our cost estimate, but pay items as well, the things that are going to make up our proposals. Fuel costs is something that we see a lot of attention paid to lately, as fuel costs seem to be inching up a little bit. We want to talk about those, and certainly any kind of activities that we have taken off in the estimate. Do those have any zero costs or quantities that look out of line? And then we wanted to talk a little bit about checklists. Last time I was on a plane, and it was not too long ago, I saw the pilot out with the clipboard walking around the airplane and looking at certain things and checking them off on their list. And as professional estimators, I think we owe it to ourselves to be able to not just kind of wing it and rely on memory, but maybe it's important for us to have a checklist that we follow when we're putting the estimate together. So I've worked with a lot of different organizations, and this is something I just got off the public domain. But these are some things that people want to think about, right, as they're putting an estimate together. So, do we have a risk register? Have we decomposed the project into a list of low-level tasks? Have we defined any deviations between values, historic, and when we come up with this estimate? So, we want to make sure that we're going through these things and we can tick them off. That's certainly one thing we can do. Another thing we can do, and this is a screenshot right out of our software. This is a report that we have called our audit report, and our customers rely on this as they're putting a cost estimate together. Do we have any pay items, for instance, that have zero prices? Do we have pay items that don't have associated cost items or a buildup of activities? Are we priced outside of particular alarm limits? We'll get into that in a moment. But these are things that our customers have asked us to help them look for. Of course, within the body of the estimate, we can do things like filter for zero quantities. We can do some analysis right here in the body of the estimate without having to run a report to see if things make sense or not. So again, the common mistakes that we're trying to avoid at this point are going to be things like resource or cost quantities that don't true up, pay items, costs or quantities that don't true up, fuel costs. This is something that, again, we're going to talk about a little later, but within our estimating tool, for instance, we've got the ability to come into a place called job properties. And here what we can do is we can actually affect fuel costs across the project. So based on the way we've set up our equipment utilization, we can specify a consumption rate. In this case, I've said that each piece of equipment is going to consume so many gallons of these particular types of fuel throughout the estimate. These are estimated fuel values, and if I change them here in one place, I'm basically updating my entire equipment fleet for this project without having to dial into each and every piece of equipment and make those adjustments. So it's kind of a handy way. We've pulled the fuel outside of the equipment register and allow our customers to make those modifications here in one place. So these are some things we want to make sure we're avoiding, making common mistakes. As an estimator, I know that the bid review process can be very stressful. It can be very painful. These are not things you necessarily have to wait for the 11th hour to address, right? So if I know I'm putting this estimate together and this bid is going out on Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I can be looking for these things, right? I still want to look for them on Thursday and Friday, but I can sort of get ahead of that curve a little bit. So we talked about these reports and these checklists. The next thing we want to be able to do is we want to be able to defend our cost estimate. We're going to talk about benchmarks here in a moment. I think that's one area where our tool can really help our customers. But there's some common sense approaches to these as well. For instance, one of the trends that we're seeing in the market right now is that as the market seems to be getting better, it seems as if there are more opportunities, more projects out there for our customers to bid on. I got a note this morning, in fact, from a customer we did some training and some implementation services for last year, who said, hey, we're hiring In fact, we met with 5 candidates last week, and we hired one of them. So as customers are bringing newer estimators on board, it's really, really important that this organizational knowledge gets shared. Benchmarking is one way of doing that, but the second bullet point on this list is just simply consulting with colleagues. Maybe we've got some people in the field that are familiar with the work. Maybe they're not necessarily estimating tool users, but when we talk to them about man hours per ton on a steel project, or the different activities that they broke a work item down into to be able to effectively build it in the field, that's really the wheelhouse of these folks. So we don't want to leave that on the list. We think it's really important to, while we're looking at data, we're also talking to people, consulting our colleagues. A third thing we want to really consider, and this probably goes without saying, but I would be remiss if I didn't include it as part of this presentation, is, are there any gotchas in the contract itself? What sort of assumptions are we making based on the scope? What sort of conditions need to be met? Are there liquidated damages? Are there issues that can get us in trouble or expose our organization? And that leads us to the fourth item, which is really identifying, trying to flesh out what risk there is in this project. If we do take this project at this price, what are we exposing ourselves to? And are there ways of mitigating that risk, right? So maybe the risk goes unmitigated, and maybe we monetize that somehow in the estimate, or at least we have a contingency bucket that we can draw from. Or maybe there's some risk that's just too outstanding. Maybe that's a good thing to bring up in a pre-bid meeting with the client, and to flesh those things out. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to take a look at what some benchmarking output might look like. So in this case, this is we're looking at some concrete formwork that we're going to be putting in, and we've measured this by the square foot. And this little scatter graph gives me a lot of different data points, a lot of good information about this particular estimate. So I'm estimating this is going to cost about 75 cents a unit. And this scatter graph gives me data points. The blue circles are previously estimated values for doing this kind of work, and the blue triangles are my as-built, or my historic actuals for performing this kind of work. And where the little orange box sits right in the middle of the screen, that's sort of my median, or my average value for doing this, including both my estimated values as well as my actual values. So in this case, I'm pretty far outside of a range. In fact, we've only done it once where it's cost more money than what I'm estimating at this place. So I would expect to get challenged on this during review, especially if there's a lot of man hours and cost tied up in this item, something that would present a lot of risk to a contractor. So the way, and we'll explore this live in the tool as well, but you can see down on the legend at the bottom, I have defined my green area as being between 0 and 6% variance from that average. My yellow area goes out, picks up there at 6% and goes off to 12%. And anything over 12% variance from the average, I wanted to see here in the red section. So I know that my current estimate, I'm firmly entrenched in that red section. I would be expecting to get some questions asked about this. Why are we so high on this particular item? Well, again, there might be perfectly good reasons for that, right? Maybe the work is in a confined area, or maybe it's going to be at height, and the guys have to work in an elevated platform. Maybe this particular customer requires some sort of specialized personal protective equipment, or PPE, that's going to play into this. So again, the purpose of benchmarks is not necessarily to get your data points all aligned with the average. We know just from real world experience that's not the case. But if we are outside of that range, are we prepared to defend that? And again, I'm going to jump into the live tool for this, because I think we can do some things that would allow us to put some context around this. So the way this project is broken down, it's by discipline. There's some pipeline work, there's some concrete work. When I get into the civil work, this is where I've taken off my concrete flat work. And when we get into the erect, strip, and form work, this is the item that we were just looking at on the screenshot in the PowerPoint. But what's neat about this is now I can start affecting my settings. So if I came in here and I looked at my settings, and this gives me a little bit more context too, as I'm hovering my mouse over any of these data points, it's telling me the projects that were used for analysis. And this is telling me that I used this project that has a code. You see it right there in the middle of that tooltip, PCM003. So, maybe I know that that was a good project for maybe benchmarking the pipe works or the pipeline, but not so much on the concrete. So I've set some general project level filters, but I want to look at this in a little bit more context, and I want to exclude the data points that are coming from that PCM003 project. So again, maybe I know I have some firsthand information about that project, realize it might be a great source to benchmark other types of work, but within the concrete discipline, it's really not a good fit for whatever reason. Now I can hit the OK button and redraw the lines, and I'm a little closer to being in the yellow. So you can kind of see how that might work. I don't want to use the word cherry pick because we don't necessarily want to back into a set of historic data that's going to best support our estimate. But again, we can eliminate those that we know offhand aren't good fits, and we can focus on the ones that are probably a better fit. So am I squarely in the green zone? No, but again, that wasn't the idea. The idea was to be able to alert me if I'm a certain percentage away from my average data point. And again, my job as an estimator is to talk about the specific requirements or the specific conditions on this job where we think it's going to result in a higher unit cost. You'll also notice some of my other settings include not only looking at, for instance, the item quantity against the x-axis or the horizontal axis, but maybe I'm interested in looking at date. Maybe I want to see if these costs are trending upwards or downwards over time. The y-axis, the vertical axis, maybe I'm more interested in looking at some measure of productivity. Maybe I'm interested in looking at the man hours per unit or the units per man hour. That tells me a different story. The costs are important, but maybe I'm doing this work in another area where the wage rates are different, or maybe maybe we're seeing a temporary increase in the cost of materials, and I don't want that to skew my benchmarks. Maybe some of our benchmarking data is from a few years ago where the rates no longer hold up. So many of our customers tell us that when they're benchmarking their productivity, not necessarily their costs, it gives them a different story as well. So very quickly I can come in here and change the benchmarking criteria, and I can see that, I'm within that 0.02 range. So these all trail off by many, many decimal points. But if that were my key driver, 0.02 man hours per unit, I can see I'm firmly right along that because all of these data points are within that 0.02, at least to the first two decimal places. So again, this is your organizational data being used for you when you're putting your estimates together. You can look at these benchmarks and see if this is something you need to spend some more time with, or as I mentioned earlier, maybe this is something that's going to be outside of your comfort zone, outside of that range, but maybe there's a really good reason for it and you've accounted for that in your cost estimate. And so we're still in that section where we're talking about internal stuff. And I wanted to just talk about a few other things we might want to make sure we've considered. So in many cases, even when a project owner provides quantities, they haven't really done a thorough takeoff of the work. They've maybe hired an engineering firm, or they've looked at similar past projects and they've looked at the quantities on those. And, from their perspective, especially if it's a unit price type of a bid proposal, they'll want to normalize all of the different unit rates based on a set of quantities. But My first question up here is, have we performed our own takeoff or quantity survey? And are we aligned with the customer, with the client in terms of those quantities? If not, there's a few different things we can do. Certainly we can draw those quantity takeoffs out, and especially if there's large variances, we can understand why the client might think there's going to be more or less scope than we do. And depending on the contract terms, right? So we've studied the contract, and maybe it is a true unit price project where we're going to get paid for the units that we produce or that we install on site. So maybe it's important for us to take those quantity differences into consideration when we're pricing our proposal. So keep in mind that, we're going to price our job, our individual items, typically based on what it costs us to do the work, but then we've got some indirect costs. Maybe we've got some profit margin as an objective that we want to spread back to these items. If the client thinks that we're going to do more work than we really think we're going to do, maybe those items aren't good candidates to spread our fixed indirect costs or our profit back to. Maybe if there's something that's going to go over what the customer thinks, maybe there's an opportunity for us to look at those items as well. But if there are huge quantity swings, maybe we want to get out ahead of that, especially if we're taking quotes from different subcontractors. Maybe one of our subs just plainly forgot something. And this is one of those areas, Carolyn, where I like to get up on my soapbox and do a little.
You never have a soapbox, right?
Do a little bit of providing a little bit of input to the market based on my feedback and my experience. It seems as if historically in construction, I can only win if somebody else loses. And I think that we're seeing a lot of different approaches to projects where customers really want to have more of an integration with their delivery team, and we try to avoid all of these issues. But if I've got a subcontractor out there that is really misaligned on the quantities, and maybe I've taken a lot of effort to come up with my own takeoff, and I don't want to just give that away, but maybe I want to make sure that, have you really considered this? Have you looked at the scope? Do you understand what's really going to be happening here? Because I don't want to take advantage of anyone, and certainly I don't want anyone experience any kind of financial distress on my project, because it just means I'm not going to get access to the A team, I'm not going to get my stuff done on time, and it's going to be a poor reflection on me to the client. So while the industry over the years historically has really kind of jumped on mistakes or the people leaving things out of an estimate, I truly believe that if we call those things out, we're going to avoid a lot more headaches down the road than we would recoup on someone else's mistake. So I'll get down off of my soapbox.
I thought you were going to say pick up the phone. I was waiting for you to say it. Pick up the phone.
Pick up the phone and call the individual. Hey, what's going on here? And the same thing goes through with material vendors as well. Are they all quoting the right quantities? And then are we actually doing an apples to apples comparison when we are taking quotes from a third party? So I'll show an example of that. For instance, in this same project, and again, I'm just using our tool as a backdrop to explore the context of this. If I look at what we call our quote comparison and award form, what we're doing here is we really want to make sure that we've got alignment in terms of the scope that we're looking at for this particular work. So here I'm looking at, maybe I want to do this by quote group, and I want to look at this concrete work. Let me go into this particular project. It's got a little bit more better example. So again, we're going to be comparing some quotes we've received from subcontractors. And what I've done is I've monetized some of the things that our customers tell us are important to them. So, for instance, I've taken some quotes on some signage items here, but I wanted to make sure I was really doing an apples-to-apples comparison. So what does that mean? Well, I know for this particular project that the signage work is going to be phased, and I want to make sure that my subcontractors have included into their pricing additional mobilization costs due to that phasing. So I can see here my example sub 3 has included that. That little tick box means there's no adjustment I need to make to their bid. But example sub, wait for it. Example sub 4 over here did not include that in their estimate. So I'm adding another $1,800 to sort of level out their bid. Same thing goes for a survey layout. Now sub 4 over here included all this other stuff, but sub 3 didn't include any money for a survey or for someone to stand on the side of the road with a flag, because some of these signs have to be put up, while the flow of traffic is continuing. So these are the sorts of things I wanted to make sure that included in their pricing. If you're buying materials, think about FOB job site versus FOB vendor's yard. So again, all we're trying to do here is make sure that everyone is, we're judging these quotes on a true apples-to-apples basis, and that when I'm looking at these comparable totals, these are the ones that actually include anything that might have been left out or not included in that particular subcontractor's quote. So that's really what I'm talking about here when I'm saying, are we doing a true apples-to-apples comparison? So someone might look on the surface as if they're the super low price, but if we have to go out, or if they're going to mark us up with change orders, or if they're going to try to hold up the project to get paid for these things, again, we might be avoiding some headaches down the road if we flush some of this stuff out ahead of time. And yes, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So let's take a look at those and make sure that they understand the scope that they're bidding on. So again, here's a screenshot of what we took you through from that analysis of the signage work that we were going to review. So that's all the internal stuff, right? We want to make sure our cost estimate is tight. We want to make sure that it lines up appropriately with our history, and if it doesn't, there's some justification for that. We want to make sure that the third parties that we're getting quotes from are giving us good enough data where we can do a true apples to apples. Now I want to talk about sort of the market elements that are at play here when we're putting this bid proposal together. So, this goes down to understanding our relative strengths and weaknesses. So, for instance, the first bullet point there, physical location of plants and equipment. I'll give a couple of examples here I've seen over the years. The traditional example might be, this is a big paving job here in Arizona, especially here in metropolitan Phoenix. They're doing a big job of scraping off and taking off the super paved pavement that went down. I just like saying super paved pavement. Super paved pavement. They're taking off the super paved pavement that they put down several years ago, and it's time to repave that. So if I were a contractor bidding on that work, and if I had some asphalt plants co-located next to where the work is going to be done, I might have an advantage, right? I might have an advantage over Carolyn, who has to truck her asphalt mix in from miles away. There's costs associated with that, obviously.
You're welcome.
As we go further outside of the metropolitan area, maybe we're looking at some work being done out on our beautiful Arizona highways, and maybe I've got a section of that work, and as the state is going to let the next section, maybe I've got an advantage because I've already got some equipment out there that's mobilized already, right? So things I want to think of. Maybe I'm at a disadvantage if I'm not doing any of that work, and they're letting out a part of the road that's in a rather remote area. So we want to think about where our equipment assets are, and see if I think that's kind of a common sense. The next one on the list is the availability and skill level of my internal resources. So again, as the market conditions sort of pick up, what we're seeing is our customers are spread pretty thin. Maybe a customer has already negotiated access to the A-team that I mentioned earlier. So we need to take into consideration the availability and skill level of our internal resources. Also, are we chasing after work that's familiar to us, or does this represent a new type of work for us? So again, these are things that can help us really determine our strengths and weaknesses. If it's not a state kind of rip and read unit price type of a proposal, and we're getting into negotiated work, have we considered, the way the client is asking us to pitch the work? I've seen a lot of cases where our customers have a very solid cost estimate and they've got a very attractive commercial proposal, but one of the areas where they need a little bit more help or they just haven't had a lot of experience with is that technical proposal. How do we propose to go about and build the job? Or a lot of times what we're seeing in the negotiated work area are, the client is very keen on getting team bios, resumes, show us profiles of previous projects. So one of the things we're advocating to our customers is as you're out building these projects, take pictures, document what that project is going to bring in terms of value to the community, and put that in a document management tool. It just so happens, Carolyn.
Yeah, we visited that client.
We visited that client, and we've got a document management tool that we can put all that stuff in. So anecdotally, if you're sitting in your organization and there's a lot of people in the biz dev group, business development group, coming to you and asking you for resumes of your project team, or, hey, do you have a similar project profile that we could leverage for this? Maybe there are some inefficiencies in that sort of sneaker net or that email chain that's going around through your organization. Maybe there's ways all of this data can be posted in a common area where people can leverage it. We run into that a little bit ourselves as we're responding to RFPs as the market's kind of picking up. And then are there complementary opportunities to sort of get paid on both ends? And again, the classic example there is maybe I've got two earthwork projects going on that are nearby each other, and one involves a big cut. They want some excavation done. We got to haul the material off site, and I'm working on another project nearby where maybe they're trying to level or fill to grade. So maybe there's an opportunity to get paid from cutting material from one job and filling it to another job. So those are things we just want to make sure we're considering as we're understanding our relative strengths and weaknesses on a particular project. So these are all market vectors, right? And as we're considering the market, let's take a look at market conditions. So we already talked about the availability and the skill level of our resources. What about the availability and skill level of any sort of specialty contractors or materials that we're going to need on the project? Thinking about my competitors, what's the state of their business, right? Are they enjoying a pretty big backlog? Are they going to be aggressively estimating or bidding on this project? Maybe there's some new competitors that just rolled into town. We see that a lot when things get good. A lot of folks come in from neighboring states and try to pick up work. Are they looking to build a decent backlog here in town? Have they already got one? So again, should we be adjusting our pricing based on these conditions? One of the things I like to think about as well when we're talking about market conditions is, have I aligned the correct skill level of labor craft with the work? And what I mean by that, I'll jump into this project file as well. I want to be making sure that I'm using the right rates for a project, and not just the right labor rates, which is, pretty standard fare for an estimator. We've got rates in here for our different skill levels. But maybe one of the things I want to be able to justify or to defend is, when were these last updated and who last updated them? So we've got a couple of data fields in our tool that tell us when, a little too quick with the mouse there, last changed by, last changed on. So maybe this is good information for me. When were these rates really last updated? So maybe I work in an area where, the rates don't change but every couple of years, but here I've got a project engineer whose rates were last updated 2.5 years ago. Maybe that's something we need to look at. Who was doing the updating of the rates? Was it me? Was it one of my colleagues? So these are things we want to consider. When were these rates last affected? Are these really the actual market rates? And then another thing I like to look at is when I'm looking at certain types of work. So again, maybe I've been estimating jobs here in this town for a while and I have a good feel for what the rates should be. Well, maybe I want to look at this maybe more by discipline and really see what is my average hourly rate for doing earthwork, for doing structural concrete. So again, our tool can give our customers some of this information. I don't need to go and review every individual resource that's working. Maybe this is a good KPI for me. I know when market conditions are good, I'd expect that hourly labor total cost per man hour to be a little higher than it is otherwise. Oh, hey, look, 4,000.20. Say it with me.
Real.
Super pave favorite. It just shows up everywhere. Now that you've heard it here, you'll probably see it popping up everywhere.
They're all going to write it into their own.
Exactly. So these are things we want to consider as well, right? What are the average rates? Maybe I'm not interested in looking at the whole spread of resources from unskilled through highly skilled. I've even had customers say, depending on the complexity of the project, we might really be interested in this hourly rate. What does that mean? Well, we're going to be doing an electrical project, and it's basically just running cable trays. There's not a lot of complexity associated with it. Maybe we can use, a little less skilled labor force to perform that work. Or maybe the project is fraught with complexity. Maybe we really need some highly skilled folks in there because it's not just simply running line from one end to the other. There's a lot of existing conditions. It's a brownfield situation. There's going to be a lot of stuff that requires specialty PPE or working in congested areas or working at height. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for that in our estimate as well. So that would be a good thing to look for. And then, depending on the customer that I'm working with, have I checked the contract language? So a lot of, I've mentioned some DOT, Department of Transportation type work in this webinar. A lot of the DOTs cap the amounts. For instance, an example there would be we want no more than 10% of the value of the contract to be wrapped up in the mobilization item. Maybe as an organization, we've bid this type of work so many times, just like the benchmarking from a cost perspective, maybe from a price perspective, we want to make sure our unit prices are defined within a preset range. Many of the public owners, even many of the private owners, are mandating MBE, WBE, DBE. We're hearing about small business enterprises. We're seeing those pop up more and more. Maybe there's a mandated requirement for their participation on the project. So really quickly, I just want to jump into the software again and talk about some of these things. The first two deal with pay item prices. So in our tool, I'm going to head over to the price section of the ribbon. I'm going to go over to our pay item and proposal form. And here what I'm going to look at is my mobilization price. So I can see I'm priced at $386,000 for mobilization. If I double click on this, I'll get some understanding as to why the item is showing in red here on this screen. And what this is telling me is I really wanted this to be priced between 8 and 10% of the total contract value. Okay, I can take a quick look at the project and I can see, this is a $20 million project. If they're going to let me get up to 10% in mobilization, I've got some more room to throw some money in mob here. So this tells me that I'd be able to get away with as much as $2 million in my mobilization cost and still be within 10% of that target total. So maybe there's an opportunity there. Some of these other items, the steel reinforcement item, that's also showing to me in red. Maybe this is priced outside of an alarm range. I'm priced at $1.60 a unit. We know a nice, comfortable place to be for this type of work is between $1 and $1.50 a unit. So again, there might be a perfectly good reason why I'm not taking advantage of a full 10% on mob. There might be a perfectly good reason why my steel is priced a little bit outside of my predefined range. But when it comes to closing a bid and going through review, we all know that those minutes turn into hours, and we don't really have a lot of time to go through item by item. So any kind of visual clue that the tool can give me, or that I've set up some conditional formatting in my tool of choice, can really help us take a look at these prices and see if they're something we need to be considering. So again, with our MBE, DBE goals, we can track several of these. Out of the box, we have 10 different goals or different MBE, WBE classifications that can be configured. Our customers can change the names of these to include things like small businesses, veterans of foreign wars, et cetera, some of those other status values that we see out there in the market. So again, these can be renamed based on our client's criteria, and I can see what my goal is. I can see what the amount I've got awarded to, in this case, a DBE supplier or subcontractor, and it's telling me over here I should find another $158,000 of things to award to a DBE in order to get this bid approved. So those are the sorts of things that we want to look for. Make sure we haven't put all this effort into this cost estimate only to have it kicked out because we didn't meet some of the qualifying criteria. And now I want to talk about, how strategic is the opportunity for us. So we've had a lot of customers say, boy, we really want to get in with owner XYZ because they just really take care of their contractors, and if we can get in with them, we just know we're going to have a great run with them. So, if it's a new potential customer and we're trying to get our foot in the door, maybe that should affect how we create the proposal package. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we drop our prices, right? Maybe there's an overall package that they're looking for, or maybe we use a quid pro quo approach where maybe we are able to lower our prices a little bit, but maybe we'd be looking in return for some schedule relief. This job has some liquidated damages, and if we don't have that facility up and running by a certain date, we're going to be exposed to some risk. So maybe that's room for some negotiation. But a lot of our customers tell us that they're very interested in new markets as they emerge. Think about 15 years ago, all of the people that started supporting the telecommunications industry. In fact, I was with a customer just a couple of weeks ago that's still a big, strong part of their work laying fiber optic cable. Think about data centers. How many of us were talking about data centers 10, 15 years ago? But it certainly seems like the high-tech firms, your Googles, your Amazons are out there building a lot of these data centers, and maybe that's something that we see as a new part of our project portfolio, and maybe we're interested in taking a strategic approach to estimating or bidding a project that can get us into a new market. Maybe there's an opportunity to expand regionally. I mentioned earlier, when things get good here in the metropolitan Phoenix area, we have neighboring contractors coming in from New Mexico and California. I was with a customer just a few weeks ago that's headquartered in Texas, and they do a tremendous amount of work in Texas, but they're looking at other opportunities to set up shop as well. As those different regions are experiencing growth, they want to be part of that as well. So maybe this all affects our pricing, right? If the stars are lining up, the planets are lining up, and we feel that this is a good fit for where we want to go as an organization, maybe that's something we want to take into consideration as we're putting a customer-facing pricing proposal together as well. So again, all kind of common sense stuff, but if it's a good strategic fit for us, then maybe we're willing to do a little bit more. And I don't mean we're going to buy the job outright, but one of the things our tools allow our customers to do is, as they're putting a price together, as they're putting unit prices together, they can see how much of that proposed price is actually their direct cost for performing that work. And now we've got some overhead, and we've got some other costs that we want to make sure we're recovering on the project. But this is letting me know I'm priced at $13 a unit. I can see $11.44 of that is cost. either direct cost associated with doing the work or some distribution of my project overheads. So when it really comes down to how much can I really cut this without hurting myself, there's my answer right there. I've got $1.57 in profit per unit on this item. Maybe if there is some wiggle room, I want to be able to understand how much I can cut without really hurting myself, right? So, Carolyn, we've got $1.57 we can play with here.
Plenty.
And then one of the things that I always also encourage people to consider as well is, how have you fared with this particular organization? And this is a good pre-bid decision point as well. If this is a customer that's always asking us for quotes, or maybe we're a specialty subcontractor, and this is a prime contractor that's always calling us, always asking us for numbers, but never really issued any POs to us, you know, do we want to really spend a lot of time putting numbers together for these folks? I mean, that's the real answer there, isn't it? What's our track record of working with this organization? How many bids have we submitted, and then what sort of return rate have we got? What are our odds of success for spending a lot of time on this, tying up our estimating resources to submit a proposal just to have it go into a black hole? Maybe as an organization, there are certain types of contracts that we're gravitating to or gravitating away from. It was interesting news just a few months ago. Very, very large international contractor said they're getting out of the public-private partnership type of arrangements. They just felt, you know, hey, that's not right for us, the way we're structured, the way we're organized. We're just simply not going to respond to those or pursue those types of opportunities anymore. Very bold statement, and I'm sure they had a lot of internal data to support that. But that makes it certainly easy when a PPP, a 3P project comes down the pipeline. They'll know, hey, that's just something we're not interested in participating in organizationally. And then, you know, are there things that are going to set us aside and, you know, give us those differentiators that are going to add value in the eyes of the owner? And again, if it's a low bid wins kind of a unit price, I referred to it earlier as sort of a rip and read type of a contract or a proposal submission, maybe there's not a lot of opportunities for us to differentiate ourselves by adding value. But if you think back a few slides when a lot of our customers were saying, you know, it's more of an interview process. They want to see previous project profiles. They want to understand the bios and the resumes of our team members. Maybe there's some work that can be done there that really allows us to stand out and puts the onus on the selection committee. Why didn't you go with this particular organization? They seem to be very, very well suited for this type of work. Likewise, I've seen contractors miss out on opportunities. Carolyn and I were in a meeting with a customer and said, you know, we just don't, we're not set up. We're really good at going out and putting utilities, wet utilities in the ground. One of the areas where we're really not that good is going to the owner's events, the client's events, and you know, it may seem like glad handling for some of this, but you know, if that's what's necessary to win, he had a very frank discussion. This was the owner of the company, had a very frank discussion with one of the engineers and said, why didn't you consider us? This is really what we do. This is our specialty work. Well, we just didn't know enough about you guys. You didn't show up at our events. You don't come to our meet and greets. And, you know, again, sort of an old school contractor, I'm sure he thought that was a bunch of hooey. But if that's what the clients are looking for, and if they really want to get to know you through these meet and greets and through these alternative delivery method meetings, then maybe it makes sense to put a small team together and pursue those. Because if that's where the work is going, if that's the way the market's changing, then maybe it makes sense to pursue that maybe in a little different format. So things to consider.
True story.
As we're putting these estimates together. One of the areas of our tool as well, this is just a screenshot, allows us to see how our prices are being perceived in the industry relative to our competitors. So you can see, in this case, we were up against two of our competitors. They were very tight. They came in at 5.4 million, 5.45 million. We're off here at 6.3 million. So again, we can see, if we keep track of this stuff, if this information is available to us, it might make sense to start tracking that. There's all sorts of business intelligence tools out there that can really make this data pop. And in fact, we've got some reporting capabilities of our own that do just that and help us understand where are we pricing ourselves relative to the market. Which brings us close to the top of the hour. We've got a few minutes left for anyone that wants to ask any questions. But Carolyn, at this point, we might want to go ahead and promote our upcoming webinar that's going to happen on Thursday, July 11th.
I will, but you have to answer the questions first. So to the audience, you're welcome to type in any additional questions from the very roundabout talk today, Rick. I think you covered just about everything for bid review. So the first one is a stocks and futures question. So get out your crystal ball.
Stocks and futures.
So it came in when you were talking about the fuel costs. I'll paraphrase because the question's a little long. But the company management is always concerned about fuel costs changing once a contract is signed and the project is underway. How does this particular tool deal with that?
Okay. Thinking hat being applied. Well, a couple different ways. One of the things we talked about earlier in the presentation were sort of the assumptions and the conditions and the terms of the contract. If it's a true lump sum bid and there's no opportunity to go back to the customer when force majeure hits, maybe we just want to make sure we've got some good coverage in there for fuel costs. One of the things that over the years our customers have asked us for, and we saw this a little earlier, is the ability to not only understand or put an estimate together what we think the costs of fuel are going to be, but we can separate that out into its own charge code or cost code, what we call an account code, that allows for these costs of fuel to really be separated, to be pulled out of the equipment, which we do anyway. But another thing that I would suggest as well, so again, we've been putting an estimate together. Our tool has this changes log, and this little tick box tells me that it's currently activated. So if I came in here and changed the cost of fuel upwards or downwards for these various fuel types, maybe I'm expecting something. So we're getting some messaging here, but let me just change the cost of diesel and gas and off-road diesel to reflect maybe where I think the cost of fuel is going when this project gets underway. Let's take a look at our changes log and see if it captured anything. So the changes log is pretty much running when I turn it on, and I'm going to scroll up to the top, and sure enough, I can see the impact by changing my cost of fuel had on the project. So just by making a couple of changes in one place, I can see that my project value went up by $6,700 just by changing that one fuel type. And if I combine that with the other one, I can see that this had a $1,300 impact on the project. So maybe if I got clever, I could combine them both into one and open them up and see what the net impact, $8,000 of exposure just based on those fuel costs. So again, I think this will go back to the contract type. If during execution we saw something where, maybe a hurricane hit our refineries in southern Texas or in the Gulf, or maybe there's some sort of a geopolitical thing that happens that causes fuel prices to go up. Maybe this is something I can go back to the client with some documentation and say, it affected my costs by $7,400. I had a modest profit in there of 1%. So maybe I'm really asking for $8,000 of relief, or maybe there's other areas we can look at within the contract terms to help offset that. So a lot of that has to do, it's a great question, a lot of that has to do with the contract terms, but I think you see how easy it is in our tool once you've made a couple of changes to understand what the impact of those changes might be and what we need to go and prepare ourselves for.
That was a good overview of that. Thank you. The other question we got was, sometimes we have large estimates, 10,000 line items. During bid review, we want to know whether a particular resource is being used within the estimate. How does the software work to help?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. When we are looking at the estimate on our tool, this is really what we call our cost breakdown structure. Now, this is a relatively, in those terms, this is a modest example. I've got 102 line items in my estimate, but certainly we've got clients that will put together estimates that have tens of thousands of line items, so I understand the concern. And I think where the question is going is I've got the ability to basically filter this cost breakdown structure down by a lot of different criteria. So if my concern is, hey, where am I using a particular skill set within the estimate? Maybe I want to filter this CBS down from the 102 items that are in the entire cost proposal to just a few items that are carrying a particular resource. So let's use our labor resources as an example. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to look at a labor resource that I know has some utilization in the estimate. I've filtered this down based on utilization count. So here's a resource that we're using. It's an operator foreman. And I'm interested to know on which line items in the CBS that operator foreman is being used. So I'd expect my filter to take us down to some number less than 102 items. And sure enough, I'm using that operator foreman on 10 items. So if I were to look inside of the details of each one of these items, I can see there's my operator foreman. Just pick a few of these at random. There's my operator foreman. And for all the marbles, there's my operator foreman. So I'd say there's the ability to identify those line items where that operator foreman is being used. We also have a resource swap capability, which is actually pretty cool because what it's going to allow me to do is to swap out one resource for another. So what that would allow me to do is maybe everywhere that operator is being used, I want to replace that operator with a different skill level of resource. So a lot of our customers do that as well. So just some different capabilities that are available in the software to be able to facilitate that. Great questions.
Oh, good. Well, if you can put that last slide back up again for the audience. You are back with us again. I want to thank you for today, Racine, and especially coming in under the weather. So much appreciated. And I know you won't want to miss it. So we're coming back on July 11th, and we're talking about how to get started with benchmarking. So if your organization isn't benchmarking yet with the data that you have already from past estimates, then this is the webinar for you and your team. So thanks, Rick, for today. Look forward to having you back in July. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Bye-bye.